Dear all, welcome to ANAMED Library Talk. At today's talk, we have distinguished speakers with us, Keane and Alkiviadis Ginalis. Today's talk is entitled More Than a Church, Late Antique Ecclesiastical Complexes in Cyprus. The church annexes of late antique Cyprus were bustling places of industry, producing olive oil, flour, bread, ceramics, and metal products. From its early centuries, the church was an economic player, participation in agricultural and artisanal production. More Than a Church brings together architecture, ceramics, numismatics, landscape archaeology, and unpublished excavation material alongside consideration of Cyprus's dynamic and prosperous 4th-10th century history. Keane offers a rich picture of the association between sacred buildings and agricultural and industrial facilities, comprehensively presenting for the first time the church's economic role and impact in late antique Cyprus. At this point, I would like to introduce you our speaker and moderator. Keane is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Tübingen, Germany. From 2026, the University of Glasgow. Her research interests in late antique and Byzantine archaeology include the economic activity of the early church, water infrastructure, and agricultural and artisanal production. During her 2022-2023 postdoctoral fellowship at ANAMED, she focused on resilience theory in 6th-9th century Cilicia and looks forward to further developing this study into a publication. Alkiviadis Ginalis is a Byzantine maritime archaeologist specializing in seafaring, harbor studies, and trade networks in the eastern Mediterranean of late antique and medieval periods. He did his MA in Byzantine Studies and Classical Archaeology at the University of Vienna and his PhD at Oxford University. Before joining the Istanbul department of the German Archaeological Institute in 2019, he held the European Union Marie Curie co-funded fellowship and worked as research fellow at the RGZM Mainz and visiting scholar at the Department of Byzantine Research of the Austrian Academy of Sciences. In 2025, Alkiviadis Ginalis was appointed assistant professor in maritime archaeology at the University of the Peloponnese, Greece. He has recently published Harbors of the Aegean in late antiquity and the medieval period, and edited Harbors of Byzantium, the Archaeology of Coastal Infrastructures. Dear attendees, please bear in mind that your video and audios are closed. Please type your questions in the chat section. Your question will be answered in the Q&A session. Now I'm passing the word to Alkiviadis Ginalis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Irem, for this very kind introduction of both the speaker, Keane, and myself. It's a great pleasure and honor to moderate today's ANAMED Library Talk. Why am I moderating it? As you heard, I'm a maritime archaeologist, but we will hear from Catherine in a few minutes how much the church was connected to the maritime world in the Mediterranean. Because beyond its role as a spiritual center and, I would say, hub or node for social interaction, from its very beginning, it played a decisive role in business and economic connectivity, even sometimes taking over the control of industry. So we can see how the church, and Catherine will guide us through her doctoral research, which was published in 2024 in this fantastic book, More Than a Church, which Irem just presented, where she, for the first time, I have to say, managed to start filling a long existing gap Why? Because so far we mostly know about the church activities through written accounts, and with the archaeology still showing a big lacuna. And I think this book is a very, very important first step to understand also the archaeological data, or how to interpret or go through archaeological data to understand a different church, a different activity of the church. But I don't want to go into further details because we are here to listen Catherine about it more, and I'm really looking forward to it. And therefore, Catherine, it's all yours.
Thanks, Alkiviadis, for the lovely introduction. And thank you also to ANAMED and to IREM for the invitation and the opportunity to present my research. I'm really pleased to be able to share it with all of you. I should be sharing the PowerPoint now, but let me know if it's not visible in any way, or if anything's wrong. And also, you should see my mouse, which I'll use as a pointer.
Now it's perfectly visible.
Cool. Thanks very much. So yeah, as Alkiviadis said, I'm a Byzantine archaeologist, and I'm currently at the University of Tübingen in Germany, with interests in the intersection of religion and economy, as well as water infrastructure and urban workshops. Today I'm going to present my book, More Than a Church, which resulted from my PhD at Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich in 2021. This book was published last year after a couple of postdocs at the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute in Nicosia and Coach University's ANAMED, as well as Philipps University Marburg in Germany. I sent my manuscript off shortly after starting at ANAMED, and I'm grateful for the supportive environment there during my postdoc fellowship. As an archaeologist with a focus in urban transformations and experiences of the late antiquity alongside the introduction of Christianity, I noticed the developing power of the church in sociocultural areas. I also noticed the architectural and art historical attention on monumental buildings and churches, resulting in narrow interpretations of auxiliary annexes and of the non-liturgical aspects of churches and clergy. Relatively newly established churches also took on other economic or administrative roles, bringing communities together in belief or livelihood. I saw an interesting opportunity to further research the complex relationships between late antique churches and secular activities. Using the example of Cyprus, my book contextualizes the experiences of late antique cities and economic networks and answers this question of how a church can be more than a church. On a material level, church complexes routinely contained installations for the production, storage, and trading of products, while institutionally the church was influential in infrastructure planning and local economies. The topic of the early church's influence is more often studied in textual sources and in the post-Roman West, but archaeological material of the church's role in production and trade is ubiquitous and had never been synthesized or analyzed until now. My main focus is on the dynamic relationships between the religious institutions and the economic activity. The administrative and productive aspects of religious institutions is well documented in historical sources, and now we're getting more archaeological material tying these two together. For my doctorate in Munich, this was on the architectural phasing and archaeological material of the annexes and their relationship to the late antique churches, or those churches with agro-processing facilities that reflect a deliberate role of the church in production. In that research, I looked at churches that had evidence of producing olive oil, flour, bread, ceramics, copper, and glass. Each chapter focused on sites that were outside of what I perceived as the norm, and I realized. When I say the norm, I mean bishops' residences next to churches, or monasteries with their own production, or pilgrimage accommodation, as these tend to be the more popular conclusion for annexes in archaeological reports. This research was fascinating to me because I expected to synthesize all the examples of churches that had added an olive press, or a threshing floor, or those which functioned as a communal resource in rural settings. But with each site, it became much more complicated, with very early participation in the mercantile world, or numerous liturgical and productive uses and phases just within the church complex. When I extended my time frame from the 4th to the 7th century to include also the 8th and 9th centuries, it got even more interesting in terms of what I have referred to as the post-destruction or post-abandonment industry. Despite what I've seen in Cyprus in my research of the correlations between churches and productive spheres, we need to hesitate and give pause at some sites before considering this a pattern or a framework. This book is an archaeological study examining the economic activity of the early Byzantine Church with a particular focus on architectural phasing. Before I present the book, I'll begin with a discussion of the development of ecclesiastical authority in the earlier centuries of Christianity, because this intersection between religion and economy is an enormous field. I'll then go through the chapters of the book, and then I'll finish with what I think the book's significance is. I'd like to set the scene with quotes from late antique sources. The first is John the Deacon, saying, "At the appropriate times, the Lord's paterfamilias discerningly doled out grain, wine, cheese, vegetables, lard, edible animals, fish, or oil, so that the universal church seemed to be nothing other than a universal storehouse." He is referring to the life of Gregory the Great, saying that in the 6th century, the church's paterfamilias was essentially a universal storehouse, implying that it should be focusing more on the liturgy and the bishop's roles. In an earlier text from John Chrysostom, we can see that already in the 4th century, there are complaints that the bishop is a little too worried about all of these types of tasks that aren't episcopal or liturgical. He writes, "Bishops vexing themselves every day about these things, for which the innkeepers, tax gatherers, accountants, and stewards are careful." These earlier texts in the 4th to the 6th centuries are interesting, especially the letters between priests in the central Mediterranean region, who are asking each other what they're supposed to do or expected to do or even allowed to do as rules and norms for the church's influence begin to get set in place. Alongside the earliest centuries of Christianity, questions arose of the power and influence of the church's authorities. When we think of early Christianity's development in the most basic terms, we tend to think of the time of Christ and his followers in the 1st century, followed by some decades of gathering in houses, before the establishment of basilicas by the early 4th century. We think of Domus Ecclesiae, such as the well-known site of Dur Europos, and then eventually of Constantine, Jerusalem, Rome, and Constantinople. The following overview describes 3 types of sources: historical, archaeological, and architectural, and I will explain all of these in order. The development of ecclesiastical authority in these early centuries has many strands, including topics like accumulating wealth, donations of property, tax exemptions, legal exemptions, rent, income, and charity. This also included developing the concept of the bishop as a steward who both looks after the community, but to whom some rules don't apply. Terms like stewardship, paterfamilias, and oikonomia were used with slightly new meanings, that a priest or bishop was now a head of household. In the Domus Ecclesiae, the head of household also provided the funding. These topics all deserve much longer attention in separate books and lectures, but for more discussion on these topics, I would recommend Sessa and Bose and the other sources listed here. Already in the 3rd century, clergy salaries were mentioned, and by the 4th and 5th centuries, disputes are recorded over the church's management and mismanagement of donations, funds, and land. By the time of Constantine, quote, every person shall have liberty to leave at his death any property that he wishes to the most holy and venerable council of the Catholic Church. These properties and lands were worked by farmers, slaves, and others, and by the late 7th century, it is documented that the church received rent on property. Similar to pagan sanctuaries, churches and their land were considered res sacrae, or in other words, could not belong to anyone or be sold. The charitable and redistributive purposes of this church's wealth and accumulated property distinguish it from other types of late antique wealth, like that of the elites. Letters between bishops reveal their doubts as to the extent of their authority and administration, and reflect the growing ecclesiastical wealth through donations. In times of crisis, church leaders intervened in ransoming prisoners or interceding for the grain supply. This naturally came alongside their other roles as de facto leaders of late antique communities as they replaced civic administrators in hearing court cases or acting as authorities for weights and measures of the market. Historical sources like chronicles, hagiographies, legal texts, donor lists, inscriptions, and papyri attest to the clergy and bishops' active administration, patronage, land ownership, and economic participation. This includes from the 5th century onwards hundreds of clergy employed by the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, an Alexandrian bishop buying wine from 500 kilometers away in Egypt, and funerary inscriptions in Korikos in Cilicia for clergy who had also other jobs such as banker, wine merchant, or net maker. As usual, some issues come to light through legal texts and complaints. For example, a framework known as the quadripartitum was already mentioned in the late 4th or early 5th century. This fourfold system was meant to regulate all the donations and income that the church was receiving, that it should be divided 4 ways between the bishop, the clergy, the maintenance of the church, and the poor. Often this was recorded when it was being broken, when the bishop was taking some or all of the funds, or the clergy then didn't have a salary, or the poor weren't getting charity, and the churches were going unlit, since funding the maintenance of the church building itself was largely going towards the oil in the lamps. Archaeologically, it comes as no surprise that the church complexes contained installations for production, storage, and trading of these products. Of course, this includes facilities for producing oil and bread for liturgical purposes and lighting the lamps. We also have mentions of the bread preparation in monasteries, etc. However, outside of this norm is a range of archaeological and architectural material, like ceramic ampullae for holy oil from pilgrimage destinations like Abu Mina, that were produced en masse on site, as well as Christian imagery on ceramics, or this steel yard listing a priest who is also a captain from Yasada. For the architectural material, such as co-located production facilities, we also have counterweights for olive oil and wine, olive oil presses, and crosses inscribed in settling vats, as well as numerous other forms of evidence in inscriptions and seals. For the architectural material, such as co-located production facilities and churches, the following overview of the book will examine many of these, so I won't expand on that here. Obviously, there can be many different reasons for all of these sources of material, and proximity to a church or using Christian imagery is not necessarily indicative of ecclesiastical control. Meticulous excavation and research can provide a more precise context for these phenomena. The strong connection between religious and secular buildings can be traced, indicating churches' influence on the local economy. Moreover, this connection suggests that the church as an institution was influential in infrastructure planning and local economic spheres. This influence has been traced for centuries on social and cultural levels, but also in economic and administrative spheres. When did this power begin, and what factors contributed to the structure and dynamics of religious institutions? The economic potential of the church appears to have been in motion already in the earliest centuries of its existence. This engagement and involvement facilitated the establishment of the power and authority, effectively transforming the religious institution into a key mercantile player. This economic power takes many forms from antiquity until today, from land management to agricultural production, resource exploitation, and civic authority. This potential and capacity extend far beyond the traditional focus on agricultural processing installations like presses and ovens for monastic or self-sustaining contexts. With variation in archaeological detectability, as well as in activity and authority, it is helpful to distinguish between 3 levels of economic involvement: exploiting agricultural and natural resources, artisanal production, and commercial participation. This book focuses mostly on resource extraction and production, and less so on commercial participation. It extends beyond the more often infrastructure, like the more often discussed infrastructure, like charitable institutions and pilgrimage complexes, or the technological advancement of productive facilities and monasteries, and the landscape archaeology of churches within productive landscapes, and export routes and trade networks, as well as material from contexts such as shipwrecks to provide insight into ecclesiastical participation in maritime networks. Until now, analysis has been lacking of this dual liturgical and productive functionality, or has been reductively interpreted as monastic or communal resources. To understand ecclesiastical economic activity, it must be researched across a large region. Despite all of these types of activity, property, and authority, and despite how early some of them are in place, it should be noted that this was not uniform nor immediately successful. Kim Bowes sums it up well by saying that it wasn't a straightforward new Christian society. She writes, the average late antique bishop was a rather anemic creature with an uncertain job description and more authority than actual power. Even the likes of an Augustine or Ambrose was confronted with limited financial resources, uncooperative elites, and imperial bureaucrats, and a systemic inability to translate theological dictates into real-world practice. Other figures, particularly holy men and women and powerful laypersons, often rivaled or trumped bishops' still nascent authority. This brings us to Cyprus and this book. The questions I sought to answer were, what was the role and relationship of the church with other practices? And how can these non-liturgical practices of late antique churches be investigated? In other words, how does archaeology reflect this economic activity that we already know about from historical sources? I searched for the archaeological evidence of the non-liturgical practices we know from textual sources. As a result, my book is a comprehensive study of ecclesiastical monuments in relation to agricultural and industrial facilities in Cyprus from the 4th to the 9th centuries. The particular focus is on the dynamics between economic spaces and sacred architecture, and is organized by the type of product or industrial activity. This map is not exhaustive, as a few more sites have come to light since the publication last year. To answer these questions with as much detail and data as possible, I expanded the parameters to a large region with a substantial number of late antique basilicas, a high percentage of which have been excavated or otherwise preserved. Confining my research to the island of Cyprus allowed for the parameters of an insular sphere, but one large enough for numerous micro-regions and a variety of late antique sociocultural developments. In late antiquity, Cyprus was a prosperous independent island that was able to build its importance through diverse trade relations as a crossroads in the Eastern Mediterranean. Its socioeconomic and cultural development was shaped by invasions and earthquakes, but also by trans-Mediterranean contact and the lively cult of saints from the earliest years of Christianity. As Christianity developed in the Eastern Mediterranean, the church established a great influence over the island. As evidenced by numerous large churches and the formation of many bishoprics. In the middle of the 7th century, the island experienced numerous Arab invasions, which damaged coastal sites in particular. From the late 7th century until the mid-10th century, Cyprus paid taxes to both Arab and Byzantine powers, a time known as a period of neutrality or a condominium or a shared period. I'm just providing the overview of the table of contents here to show that today I'll go through the 4 main chapters, which is olive oil, flour, ceramics, and copper. With a view into late antiquity, beyond late antiquity. I've also removed 2 chapters from my PhD and put them elsewhere, as they didn't match as well. Most of these chapters focus on one site, reanalyzing prior interpretations and of the scale and the purpose of the productive facilities, apart from the copper chapter, which is sits apart from that. As the remnants of olive oil production are pervasive throughout the Mediterranean, their association with churches has often been interpreted as fulfilling the sustenance needs of a monastery or local community. Common implements like crushing basins, rotary stones, and press beds, as you can see on the screen, are ubiquitous throughout Cyprus from prehistory to the modern era. Many of those belonging to the late antique period have been noted in the vicinity of both urban and rural churches, which I've plotted here on this map. The churches, as owners of these communal resources, point toward their administrative and social importance within a farming community in addition to their sacred function. One interesting site is Aya Vavara Amathus, which I see as one of the clearest examples of the church's involvement in agricultural production in late antique Cyprus. If you can see my mouse, it's here on the right in an acropolis. The small church is only a few meters from a steep declining edge towards the east. This is the view from the northwest, with the olive press area in the foreground, which is here. It has a large olive oil press at its northwest side that was clearly a significant factor in dictating the location of the church. This olive press aligns with a natural cave here on the top left that acted as a water source for the oil production. The general dominance of the industrial annexes here suggests that production was a primary consideration for this site's layout and only allowed for a comparatively small church. Because the excavation took place in the midst of political upheaval in the 1970s and was not well published, It was labeled a monastery and largely forgotten. However, the scale of the olive press relative to the church highlighted the need to revisit the question of the site as monastery. By measuring the collection vat, I approximated an output of 3,600 liters of oil a year, far surpassing the amount a small monastery would use. This amount would average to 10 liters a day, which equates to 180 people, with the average individual consumption being 20 liters a year. As a brief disclaimer, estimates for olive oil production have many factors like frequency of pressing per day and per season, as well as the size of the olive grove. When I was calculating this with Tamara Lewitt, we came to a few different options, but even if the site were a monastery, this output of oil would not be proportionate to the site's limited capacity and few residential domestic areas, and very few rooms that could be cells for a monastery that is larger than just a few people. I studied the artifacts that were kept from the dig and drew up a relative dating scheme through the building phases, alongside aspects like masonry and mosaics, starting in the 5th century. Both the masonry and the ceramics demonstrate that occupation continued until the 9th or the 10th century. Here on the top, you can see a cross-incised ceramic from the 8th to the 10th century, one of 2 of this decoration and shape known from Cyprus. The other one is from Kalavasos, a few miles away on the south coast. There was also a variety of marble pieces, pithoi, and amphorae in the storerooms. The site underwent numerous modifications in both the annexes and the church, including the addition and removal of rooms and raising the floor level in the north chapel. And you can see the north chapel, a photo here on the right. Bread and flour mills are also located throughout the annex rooms and eventually spread to the church itself in these later phases, including this one here in the north aisle. In the north chapel. Also visible here is a large round structure on the top, in the middle, which is in the middle of the yard between the church and the annexes, which likely started as a crushing basin for olives. These modifications span over 5 centuries, and my phasing indicates that the olive press bed is actually in its secondary location. This is the press bed here. It no longer aligns with the collection vat to the left here, nor the wooden beam anchor area here on the wall, and has been embedded into the floor, covered in a waterproof plaster. In this later phase, this room might have been reused as a treading floor for wine production or water storage or any other purpose. The circular structure in the courtyard also had a second story added and was repurposed. By studying the building phases across the complex, I was able to demonstrate the continued priority of productive annexes over the church and cast doubt on the site's purely monastic identity. The scale of olive oil output also indicates that this complex would have been able to export and possibly profit from it. Along with 2 other sites I studied, Panagia Chrysopolitissa in Neopafos, you can see part of the olive press here, and Ios Yorgos Heia, Basilica C, where the olive press was in the north annexes. Aya Varvara reflects the deliberate involvement of the church in producing oil. I'd like to include some other sites from late antiquity as comparenda to contextualize Amathus. The presence of olive oil installations at churches is ubiquitous, particularly in the context of monasteries or as centrally located resources for communities to use. For recent work on this topic, I would recommend those I've listed on the slide, as well, particularly Tamara Lewitt. I also include images of non-monastic sites with numerous olive oil presses throughout the site, particularly Kanladevana and Libraton Kome in southern Turkey, containing 16 and 30 olive oil workshops respectively, amidst their numerous churches. In sites like these, the priority of the agricultural product is visible. The second agricultural staple was flour and bread, which, like olive oil, was commonly produced in connection with the church for communal sustenance. There are not many textual sources referring specifically to grain and bread distribution by the Cypriot Church, but in late antiquity, wheat was the main resource of Cyprus. Archaeological remains of bread production vary from grain storage to flour mills to bread ovens, many of which I cataloged in the vicinity of late antique churches and marked on this map. Although the south side has been eroded by the sea, the Episcopal Basilica in Amathus is a well-preserved example of bread production and the ability for a church complex to recover after damage. The 5th century church was damaged by fire in the 7th century, after which broken marble fragments were stored in a closed room north of the north aisle here, and also in room 3 of the atrium here. An industrial flour mill and workshop were added on the north side of the atrium here in room 9. The church continued to be used liturgically, as indicated by the pushing aside of rubble to maintain access to the nave. There is also a textual mention by Anastasius the Sinite of a baptism in the Episcopal Church of Amathus in the late 7th century. For this site, I was able to examine the coins and the architectural phasing well into the 8th century. The various installations around the atrium date to the late 7th century by the use of in-situ coins within closed walls and elsewhere. These are some pages from the book. In room 9, as highlighted in blue, a tall workbench was assembled from spolia of the church and from earlier periods, like column bases and Hellenistic gravestones. Also in the room is a large basalt rotary mill for flour production. The neighboring room to the east, room 1, contained a low makeshift bench created by slabs laid on top of a marble Corinthian column capital, also spoliated from the church, and a stone mortar for tempering flour. Other structures added to the northeast corner of the atrium include numerous benches marked in all of these colors, as well as intercolumnal walls. A second destruction occurred in the 10th century or later, as indicated by an Abbasid coin. A large quantity of beans were stored in the narthex before this destruction. This encroachment of the productive sphere into the narthex suggests that the church was no longer serving an ecclesiastical purpose by the 10th century. This church is not only noteworthy for its first destruction in the mid-7th century and subsequent liturgical use contemporary with the flour mill in the atrium, but for its secondary grain storage in the narthex before the Middle Byzantine period. The remnant of a harbor wall extending from this church also indicates a significant level of independent activity at this site. This complex is representative of the simultaneous roles the church can play, in this case both religious and economic, but also the individual localized responses to crisis. After the Arab invasions and widespread damage of churches, each complex had a choice between abandonment, repair, or reuse with additional functions. The tacit approval, as demonstrated by the continued liturgical use of the church, leads me to believe that the site's agricultural function does not fall under a reductive category of temporary squatting. Although the rest of the site awaits publication, my study of the atrium contextualizes it within post-destruction ecclesiastical supervision of agriculture. Because these installations have relatively precise chronologies, it provides concrete archaeological data on unexplored intersections of the church and bread production in Cyprus. During a time of upheaval in Cyprus, some sites show a closer supervision by the clergy and bishops over economic activity, physically bringing the production sites closer to the churches. One of the main themes of this chapter is resilience and adaptation after damage or abandonment. After the mid-7th century, vitality can be traced throughout Cyprus. Material from this period does not always get preserved in older excavations, and numerous factors contributed to a reductive narrative of collapse and decline in historical descriptions of Cyprus in this period. Other sites in Cyprus and more recent excavations are changing these narratives and providing more evidence of the nuanced types of continuity in these gap centuries. Other Eastern Mediterranean sites bear remains of phases of occupation in the form of production within a previously religious building, or production alongside in buildings that are still in religious use. I'm showing some examples on this slide from both Cyprus and elsewhere in the Levant. These, along with the Episcopal Church in Amathus, complicate our interpretations of abandonment, demolition, and squatting, particularly across different regions and religions. Alongside the agricultural production of bread and oil, I examined natural resources and manufactured goods, namely ceramics and copper. There is a scarcity of late antique ceramic kiln sites in Cyprus, some of which are shown on this map. Until now, none have been found in the vicinity of churches. In analyzing a kiln at the coastal basilica of Kourion, With the intention to study lime kilns generally, I discovered numerous factors that suggested it was more likely a ceramics kiln that had been misidentified. It also became clear that the kiln was in use before and simultaneously with the phases of the late 5th or early 6th century church. The church is located at the bottom of the cliffs beneath the rest of the ancient city on the Acropolis and was originally located about 100 meters away from the ancient shoreline. Although the site was published, the report was brief and reflects the divided priorities of the excavation team between two sites. Numerous discrepancies in the publication plans and catalogs led me to analyze the site independently through establishing architectural phases and photographing the stored ceramic material and notes from the excavation. The main structure of interest is this large kiln on the northwest side of the complex here, and on the right side of the photo here. And here's a better photo of it. This is a profile view of this large kiln, and then this smaller one is number 14 in the north portico. It has numerous phases as well. As the building phases of the atrium and annexes began to suggest a more complex history than the report describes, I incorporated comparable types of kilns, from lime to glass to ceramic. The primary indications for the kiln to be attributed to ceramic production are the presence of two levels rather than one, an obelisk-shaped substructure in the bottom level, a lower stokehole, and its composure of local limestone. If it had been designed for lime melting, one open level would have sufficed, with an indented shelf for wooden supports of the stone to be melted, and noticeable remnants of lime on the interior. A glass kiln would need higher temperatures than this type of limestone could withstand, and the material remaining would also indicate this. As the areas north and east of the kiln were not excavated, I relied on the notes that specifically mention ceramics within the kiln. The possibility also remains that it was reused for lime in a later period, but the initial design for ceramics is a unique context in Cyprus. Throughout my cataloging of the storeroom material, I noted certain fragments resembling ceramic wasters or misfires. In later years, I brought two separate ceramicists to these storerooms, and I asked their opinions on the material, which they confirmed, and then also noted even more ceramics that were imperfect, not necessarily wasters, but usable ceramics with imperfections, which we think is a relatively too high percentage for if the site did not have a kiln. A secondary installation in the north portico of the atrium, labeled 14 on the plan, from which marble pieces were excavated, is a later lime kiln, rather than a bakery, as the excavator suggested, unless it's also a bakery that was later used as a lime kiln. This lime kiln abuts steps in the north portico, which may have been used for access to the kiln's upper level after the atrium was built. These steps were modified here. They used to lead from the atrium here and here towards this monumental entryway. Similar phasing of the late 7th and 8th centuries is visible elsewhere in the atrium, where flour mills, workbenches, and staircases were added later. The floor levels and wall phases of the ceramic kiln and the monumental entryway to the atrium demonstrate a possibility that the ceramics kiln was either contemporary with or prior to the church atrium's construction, but almost certainly independent from the atrium. In at least an early or original phase, this kiln seems to have been used for ceramic production, even if it was later used for lime melting. I'm showing here the order of events for parts of the complex mentioned today, and I'm omitting other bits of the annexes which are discussed in the chapter. With yellow as the first or independent phase, red as the main church construction, and green and blue as either simultaneously or successively. The kiln appears to predate the church based on the building phases, and also remained in use after the church was damaged into the late 7th and 8th centuries. This is important because the church construction not only accommodated a functioning industrial space, but was deliberately positioned in close proximity to it. This inclusion of the functioning ceramic production is particularly noteworthy in its context at the harbor and under the cliffs of the Episcopal Basilica. A major theme from this chapter is agency, in terms of the choices of the construction of the church, its location, its proximity to a ceramics kiln, and who benefits from the sale or export of those ceramics, or just local use of those ceramics. Other late antique church sites sometimes preserve evidence of construction that was interrupted in the form of temporary kilns or workshops for mosaic production, but this appears to have deliberately incorporated the kiln area into the church complex and maintained its use throughout the following centuries. Both this church and the Episcopal Church in Amathus are great examples for our analysis of crisis, upheaval, and the choices made after upheaval to regain stability, but also of the changing use and social history of religious buildings. The final product requires a different approach than the previous three, as the archaeology of mining and metalworking is more so tied to the landscape than semi-portable grain mills or olive presses. The island is renowned for its copper resources from the foothills encircling the Troodos Mountains. As I consider this topic in need of a synthesis from the 4th to the 10th centuries, I combined landscape surveys of the large regions of mining areas with excavation reports of the coastal sites through which the copper was exported. I focused on churches and indications of late antique Christianity connected to the copper industry, many of which are mapped here. I closely examined the copper mining aspect of some sites whose reports had only highlighted the church, as well as surveys of mining and smelting remains that used late antique networks or bore Christian names. The metallurgical processes here comprise the mines themselves, but also slag heaps, or these heaps of waste material called slag from the smelting process, and the export routes on the coasts as well. The area of the largest output of copper in antiquity is a prime example showing the roles of the church in industrial activity. The Skoriotis mines in the hinterland of Soloi contains a slag heap that measures more than 300 meters in length, which is here in blue, going off the map, but would have been even larger before modern mining in the area. Recent research established the mine's use until at least the 7th century, much longer than originally thought. I accessed the area currently protected by a UN base and noted architectural fragments from a late antique basilica near a 15th century church, including an altar currently used in the 15th century church. Parts of a marble iconostasis and architrave measured to a church that would have been more than 5 meters in width. Their decoration and the style of the altar likely date to the 5th to the 7th and to the 9th to the 11th centuries, based on my comparisons to other examples in Western Cyprus. 3 additional column fragments, including a capital measuring 70 centimeters, do not match each other or the 5-meter wide church and may represent an earlier or later church or temple on the site. The 15th century church's name, Panagia Skoriotissa, translates to Our Lady of the Slag, and therefore clearly bears a significant relationship to the surrounding industrial landscape, at least by the late antique period. It is noteworthy that these fragments strongly indicate that numerous phases of churches or other monumental buildings were established in this area as early as the 5th to the 7th centuries, and that it was worthy of marble decoration as well. A second example of the complex relationship between mining and Christianity are the settlements at the Alestos mine, marked here as Aia Maria Mavrovouni on the top right map. These low-quality settlements are located right next to the mining and smelting areas, and the noxious, which are noxious. The team researching this site interpret the ceramics and the proximity to the metalworking areas as indicative that these communities were likely controlled privately for export and profit. Evidence of another church exists at this settlement, which may have been built by the laborers themselves, although it is not preserved and has not been excavated. Here I would like to draw a comparison from this process of Christianizing an industrial landscape to the persecuted Christians condemned to labor in metal mines, which Eusebius notes in the 4th century to have built their own places of worship at the mines. I will be developing this topic in a forthcoming co-authored article and will not elaborate here anymore. That the copper from both Alestos and Skoriotissa was exported here through Soloi on the north coast, and that both received at least one church in the late antique period, sheds light on the pervasive presence of the Christian community throughout varying economic contexts. Skoriotissa's basilica was decorated with marble and much more accessible in the densely populated low river valley. The beneficial nature of this arrangement through Soloi likely funded Skoriotissa's construction and maintenance of monumental buildings, but also mutually benefited Soloi and its reconstruction after the Arab raids. The quote here refers to the repairs of buildings after the mid-7th century raids. At numerous copper export routes, a sense of Christian control and visibility was established by the presence of the churches, and my research reveals that these patterns were clearly emerging already in late antiquity. Compared to the divine protection over ports and harbors, the church's visibility at the mines and the metal workshops is notably lesser in terms of monumentality and quality, yet still maintains a strong conceptual identity throughout the landscape. This is demonstrated also by Kalavasos and the Basilikos Valley on the south coast of Cyprus, where churches and settlements accompany the route for copper export from the mines to the coast at Sigi. By synthesizing examples like this throughout the island, I was able to reframe the lens on the copper industry by focusing on the connection between cult and metallurgy, which, as demonstrated by the foundation of churches, pervaded the landscape from extraction to export. Here, I think a brief comment on the materiality and monumentality of the slag itself is worth mentioning. Michael Given has written on this aspect in 2018, discussing the visual impact of these large artificial landmarks. Their immovability and striking color contributes to a sense of monumentality in the mining landscape, but just by themselves. And it is worth asking how monumental the churches were if they were small chapels dwarfed by the slag heaps. But this is also explored in forthcoming research, and I just wanted to make a brief note of it. Although it is difficult to connect the metallurgical activity with ecclesiastical authority, in this chapter I aimed to provide a thorough bundle of data together to suggest the possibilities through numerous sites. For sites without textual evidence, there's an ambiguity between identifications of clerical supervision or enslaved Christians building chapels or monumentalizing the landscape, or the general prosperity in the wider economy resulting from the mined material. The church's productive and economic roles continue into the late 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries, albeit in altered forms. With a shift towards demonetization, handmade ceramics, architectural innovation, and migrations, the island adapted to a shared status between the Arab and Byzantine powers. The theme of continuity and vitality in this period is a substantial topic in Cypriot scholarship, to which I provide the view from the economic activity of churches. The experimental addition of domes and vaulting to basilicas in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries is accompanied by continued dynamic workshops in those same cities, like those in Amathus and Kourion. At Kourion, new additions in the atrium of the Episcopal Basilica on the Acropolis were interpreted as temporary facilities for the workers demolishing the church while moving to nearby episcopi. However, these ovens and hearths are numerous large-scale installations and surpass a short-term use. Along with the seals and coins found in this context, the sequence of events of the abandonment and move to episcopi become complicated by the substantial presence of economic workshops. By studying numerous examples of economic vitality in connection with Cypriot coastal churches such as these, I provide even more information towards bridging the gap of the 7th to 9th centuries. One of the main contributions of this study is its significant corpus of information on the topic across a large region over 5 to 6 centuries, not just on a single church complex or site. This, I hope, provides a useful resource for both how the archaeology of the church economy looks in these early centuries, but also new plans and photos of many sites replacing some that are decades old. This book serves as a synthesis of most of the late antique churches in Cyprus, but also primarily an analysis of churches with economic functions that are outside of the categories of bishop's residence or monastery, like I said before. Because of the complex nature of these buildings, and I've included a few slides from the Gazetteer at the back, which includes bibliography, dates, economic material, photos, and plans. Because of the complex nature of these buildings, communities, and histories, I've deliberately avoided reducing the sites into categories. Many of them overlap in topics like post-damage or post-liturgy agriculture, or in terms of the products manufactured, and categorization like these on the left would be unhelpful in separating these sites. Cyprus is not just an interesting case study within the topic of how the church's economic activity developed. It has always been a hub in the Eastern Mediterranean in terms of cultural and intellectual exchange, socioeconomic networks, and religious identities, as well as a strategic military location. This is no different during late antiquity and into the Middle and late Byzantine periods. The activity of ecclesiastical communities played a role in this central, connected aspect of the island's cultural identity and history. This book therefore adds texture to our understanding of the late antique prosperity and transformations of the island in these centuries and leads to future research of the economic and religious landscapes. This book includes concepts used in my doctorate and in my postdoc. Archaeological methodologies emphasizing agency and resilience. The theme of human agency and viewing the individual as an agent of social action is still relatively new in Byzantine scholarship, demonstrated, for example, by clergy in economic embedding or adapting annexes as advantage. Rather than using terms like active or passive agents for, respectively, decision makers and those oblivious to their behavior's results, instead, we can frame individuals as instruments or bearers of the transformation, whether it's economic, political, or religious. The omission of the individual agent has contributed to an obfuscation of both the community's manipulation of existing social structures and the changing constructs within late antiquity's social and administrative conditions. Although individual actors are dependent on the conditions and structure of their society, they also have a choice in influencing their environments, resulting in dynamic relationships between actions and structural change. The selective modification of both churches and agricultural workshops demonstrates a continuous redefinition of the church's increasing role throughout late antiquity, thereby constituting a collective agency. Researching Byzantine crises and resilience theory also provides a background against which to analyze historical sources as well as new archaeological research in topics like plagues, earthquakes, climatic shifts, and political instability. Resilience theory comprises addressing adaptive cycles, researching the scale and frequency of crises, modeling the destabilizing effect of overlapping traumas, and understanding how communities regain stability. The church's mercantile role played a significant role in adapting, recovering, and managing land. In this book, attention has been paid to 6th to 8th century loss, transformation, trauma, renegotiations of space, and the abandonment of settlements. By connecting the various sites, their histories, and the economic activities represented among them and their churches, it both complicates and sheds new light on the trans-regional histories of the Byzantine world. Late antique scholarship over recent decades has focused on themes such as decline, transition, transformation, and now resilience. Despite agreement on the reality of continuity and survival over earlier narratives of collapse, these are both still reductive polarizations, and aspects of trauma, risk mitigation, and abandonment warrant a more complex interpretation. While it is important to correct unhelpful traditional interpretations of communities or societies within a dichotomy, there can also be a bias toward the surviving communities, or towards seeing resilience as an attribute of individuals rather than a process. Examining the variety of late antique responses and recoveries after upheavals will also help redefine and consolidate the view from insular, coastal, and rural communities. Community adaptation is visible through the reuse of monumental spaces as industrial areas, like relocating the agricultural facilities or cultivating gardens within city walls, or new shops and residences. These new forms of social organization have been perceived as indications of cultural decline, and socioeconomic decline during and after wars between the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate has been traced in changes to coin production, long-distance trade, and building programs as well. With new attention within historical and archaeological scholarship to subjective individual experiences rather than imperial political events, this book provides new interpretations and anthropological insights on belief systems and tributary or feudal economies. Focusing on inhabitants as conscious agents in constantly changing circumstances highlights the local, varied nature of resilience in renegotiated spaces, thereby shedding a critical new light on Byzantium and religious anthropology. In the context of changing and adapting socioeconomic networks and religious identities, even before upheavals, arguments about continuity can be simplistic, envisaging the apparent continuity of a society as though it were a single entity or a monolithic cumulative event which needs no further investigation. This book fits within the newer approaches of resilience archaeology, which complicates and expands on continuity over collapse while still applying these frameworks to the church's economy. Scholarship concerning the intersections of religion and economy has begun to develop to include concepts like temple society, spiritual economy, and religionseconomy. And I'm referring to these generally as religious economic models for now, for the purpose of this presentation. These concepts concern religious activity as an economic system in itself, with immaterial goods and behaviors, production and consumption, such as immaterial commodities obtained or given at religious institutions, and on religion as the economic product. Therefore, religion models will accompany my future research on this topic, as well as new frameworks informed by them for economic models. As part of future steps in this topic, it is possible to examine other products and aspects that indicate economic activity beyond just agriculture, like olive presses and ovens, or industry like metal workshops and mines. These include facilities, installations, resources, and production relating to the agricultural productions for consumption, livestock, hunting, fishing, baking, etc., textile, bone object production, construction of churches, mosaics, furnishing, marble leather, all of these products and industries. These will all be factored into my next development of this topic beyond Cyprus. My choice of sites and products illustrates the role of the church by illuminating their dual functionality in sanctity and industry from many angles and on different scales. I focused on the relationship between church buildings and their adjacent structures, which tend to be neglected and have been insufficiently studied. By looking at the complex architectural phasing and material from these churches, I've answered my research questions on how the archaeology demonstrates the development of church economic participation and shows how economically responsive ecclesiastical leaders and communities were. This book, for me, is an important starting point from which I aim to continue researching in both database format and in future projects in the broader Byzantine Empire. These examples demonstrate the economic participation of the church, whether in the planned inclusion of workshops in a complex's original design, or later additions of facilities to an atrium. In the ports and copper landscapes, the foundation of churches among existing industrial contexts is also meaningful, projecting a Christian identity and serving as a sacred center for the community. For a topic with substantial evidence across the Mediterranean, Byzantine studies needs more attention on the non-liturgical practices of these early churches, as well as the view from the Eastern Mediterranean. This will challenge some of the basic structures that shape conventional views of ancient societies and communities by blurring distinctions between economic and religious worlds, as well as public and private space. My book helps to change our perception of late antique history by broadening the possibilities of civic power and administrative control that a church could maintain as early as the 4th and 5th centuries. Synthesizing the broader archaeological context of this topic across Cyprus sheds light on the church's economic interests and opportunities in many industries, and this approach could be applied to future scholarship in the region. By providing artifactual, architectural, productive, and topographical data from numerous sites of such a central institution, one with which all late antique society was in contact, it was possible to gain insights into a topic which we currently have little understanding. The book's key concerns are with communities maintaining or developing coherent economic systems and compromising in their use and planning of artisanal and agricultural spaces. It also pertains to historical material of church complexes, monumental architecture and decoration, and historical material, inscriptions, hagiographies, and property documents, in cases where wealth earned through economic activity funded church construction. By combining certain decorative elements or advancing architectural designs such as domes, churches reflected a significant investment by current landowners, as well as connectivity across frontier regions like Cyprus. This also reflects a certain level of economic power and presupposes systems in place for later recovery. This book contributes to scholarship on late antique Cyprus, but also to our societal understanding of religious institutions as economic agents. It can be also useful as a foundational study for other time periods and other regions. For example, the association between temples and olive oil, and the relationship with divine protection as seen in the Bronze Age and Archaic periods. Themes of power, agency, resilience, and innovation in relation to religious institutions and economic structures will be central for my study of other time periods, both Roman and Middle Byzantine. This theoretically wide-ranging cross-disciplinary analysis is useful for other scholars and students of the long late antiquity on urban transformation in the Byzantine periods, and for sacred landscapes. This research on the economic power of religious institutions lies at the intersection of these new areas of scholarship regarding late antiquity and religious transformation. The social history of the church within its communal contexts, land management, sociocultural significance, indicates the financial status of patrons and communities, as well as artistic and liturgical shifts. These monuments were dynamic, fluctuating in their material form and in their sociocultural significance. They might be central focal points for settlements, modified with agricultural facilities, associated with fortifications or with trade routes, or they might be experimentally renovated or abandoned. Research on the transformations of the late antique world cannot be complete without understanding the socio-economic impact of the church, which Ian Wood recently argued controlled perhaps a third of the total wealth in the post-Roman West. He emphasizes that whereas some historians of religion have investigated what has been termed the spiritual economy, a concept which tends to privilege the spiritual rather than the economic, most economic historians have paid scant attention to religion. He would argue that the early medieval economy cannot be understood without paying proper attention to the church as an institution in its own right, nor indeed can the church be understood without recognition of its economic infrastructure. The Byzantine East experienced a different economic and religious trajectory than the post-Roman West, but little attention has been devoted to understanding the church's undoubted role as an economic actor. Disciplinary distinctions within late antique and Byzantine studies between socioeconomic history, cultural history, art history, and archaeology have hampered investigation of this topic. In particular, archaeological data has not been fully integrated into historical analysis of the church's socioeconomic development. The goal of this book was to produce a more holistic, comprehensive understanding of these religio-economic relationships, which will be significant for many other fields, uses, and applications. It is possible to rectify outdated understandings of the Byzantine economy by involving the sociocultural role of the church. By adding archaeological perspectives at local scales, this book provides a valuable comprehensive data set across the well-connected areas and a potential step change in scholarship of this period. Pervasive misconceptions polarizing the early church into either purely religious or pursuing sociocultural dominance can be confronted by my argument that the institution's religious function cannot be separated from the material basis of the host of social and economic actors out of which it was composed. Drawing on a substantial body of archaeological and historical data, this book moves beyond the traditional view of the church as self-sustaining through its ownership of production, or parasitic on the communities that it served, and towards a broad exploration of the church as a participant embedded in and contributing to local communities, both in charity and socioeconomically. The reality of living in late antique Cyprus was entering a church via an atrium with a functioning flour mill or bakery, working in the copper mines with chapels dotted across hilltops or near slag heaps as beacons or supervisory monuments, maintaining ever smaller versions of previous basilicas amidst encroaching olive oil and bread production, or partly repairing a damaged church by piling rubble to the side and continuing to fire ceramics. Understanding not only the impact of the changing environment on the individual or community, but also their influence through transitional and innovative urban developments builds a new understanding of dynamic late antique settings. Thank you very much for coming to my lecture and for your attention. And I would also like to thank